Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our third soil session, which today is around cover crops and the healthy soil effect. For those of you that don't know, I'm Wendy Hewitson, and I'm the AgriTech Programme Manager for Barclays Eagle Labs. So I don't know what you know about Barclays Eagle Labs, and I don't know what you know about healthy soil. So that's why we've all come together this evening. So first off, I'm going to do the regulatory disclaimer, so please do bear with me. We today have asked Paul Brown, East Technical Advisor for King's, and also Jacqueline Hannon, Senior Research Fellow in Pedology from Cranfield University, to join us. They're going to talk today and provide some hints, tips and tricks on cover crops and the healthy soil effect. These topics discussed are an overview of the options for you to think about and to help you with your independent research and business decisions. So they are not intended as recommendations or advice. Please remember as well that your business has its own individual circumstances, and as such, the statements and views expressed may not be applicable or suitable for your business. So let's get back to tonight and let's look at as a cover crops and the healthy soil effect and how we, as the AgriTech programme within Barclays Eagle Labs, can support you. So who are Barclays Eagle Labs? Barclays Eagle Labs are the largest business incubator in the UK. And we have three key goals that we can look to attain. The first one is around the acceleration of UK businesses, where we look to connect agri-tech startups to research and development, expertise, farmers, and the supply chain. Next stage is around the collaborative innovation, where we hope to stimulate innovation and collaboration. And then what are we here for tonight? That's all around Industry 4.0. And what we aim to do through these sessions and all our other events is demystify Industry 4.0 for our farming clientele, for you, and also become the voice of the farmer to the industry. So what do I want to achieve? What is my vision? My vision is to support the UK food supply chain to become the most sustainable ecosystem in the world through demystification of technology and encouraging collaboration of Pan's supply chain. Quite simply putting it, feeding the world without wrecking the planet. There's a lot of myths around agri-tech, but the first and foremost one that I'd like to raise is that Agriculture 4.0 or Industry 4.0 is a tool to support, not replace the farmer. Through this, the tools that are available, it looks to achieve higher efficiencies, savings on time, increases on productivity, and also making the sector far more sustainable for the future. So again, what are we here to talk about tonight? Soil and soil health. Soil health is fundamental to Britain's farming system and to producing food we eat. It provides the means for plants to grow. It also helps them create the oxygen we breathe and clean the water we drink. So why are we looking at the reasons behind this? Soil can also increase our resilience to climate change. So what is the facts around soil? There are over 700 different types of soil in the UK. The more farmers know about the soils they have on the farm, the better they can make their decisions to improve the soil health of those soils. A 2018 government survey into English farming practices showed that 74% of farmers knew what soil type they had in each of their fields on the farm. But only 35% of that actually tracked the organic matter in soils. So hopefully, perhaps 100% will track what's going on in their soils. So what are we looking at tonight and through these series? We're looking at new technologies and techniques that have been developed that help farmers to look after their soils, with items such as soil impaction, reducing the amount of soil that is disturbed, and foremost, looking at improving productivity. So there are new technologies and techniques being delivered all the time and being developed further. Soil condition monitoring sensors allow farmers to collect data about rainfall, temperature, and many other metrics over time. And that tracks trends and helps predict irrigation needs. Devices capable of measuring microbial activity in soil can be in items from such as IoT, Internet of Things enabled sensors that take very little time to set up, have a long battery life, and this leads eventually, or hopefully, to less maintenance costs. So what are the benefits of new technologies? Again, IM estimates IoT, or the Internet of Things, will enable farmers to increase food production by 70% by the year 2050. Again, that could save up to 50 billion gallons of water annually. Sensors can help farmers optimize water usage and make better decisions. So better optimization of crop management will have a transformative effect on agriculture in the following years. So I think you've heard enough from me, and probably what you want to hear from is the people we've got to talk to you today and the experts in these fields. So very shortly, I'm going to hand over to Paul Brown. Now, Paul Brown is the Eastern Technical Advisor for Kings, which is a division of Frontier Agriculture Ltd. And Paul has titled up his session and his presentation this evening on cover crops, what they can do for the farming business. So I'd like to now hand over to Paul and let him take us away with the next session tonight. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Hello, Wendy.
Hello.
Well, thank you. So thank you for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. As Wendy just said, I'm going to talk to you about cover crops and what they can do for the farm business. So tonight, I want to run you through these topics. So as a brief introduction, there's particularly how cover crops fit in with the EFA system. There's next, nutrient and soil retention, yields of the following crops, some crop examples, a few, how the finances work of cover cropping, and a summary at the end. So we certainly see that cover cropping is very much about reducing soil erosion and losing and stopping loss of nutrients from land. So we're looking to go away from a photograph like this one to this sort of situation where there's a good cover crop protecting the soil over the autumn and winter. So we've certainly seen a huge interest in cover crops in the last 5 or 6 years. We've been seeing a 20% increase in activity in this sector each year. They are now appealing to most growers in a wide range of rotations and soil types. We see the 5 key benefits of cover cropping are they can deal with the need for EFA options on a farm. They are improving soil health, very much through increasing organic matter and, as I say, feeding the soil livestock, the whole of the soil biota. They're linked very much to direct drilling or min-till or reduced cultivations. They're very important for soil and nutrient retention, and for many farmers, there's also the possibility of nematode reduction. There is, of course, at the end of that, a financial gain, either as a payment or as a yield bonus in the following crops. There's a very wide range of cover crops growers can use. I'm not going to go into all the details tonight, but they vary from Phacelia in the left-hand corner, for a range of brassicas on the right-hand side, and coming back to vetches in the middle, giving farmers a very wide choice of crops to use. Is the rooting of the cover crops, which we see as the most important part. And here we can very briefly see the very different rooting for a range of different species. So the top is important as the powerhouse in the engine that drives the system, but it's the root that is creating most of the soil health benefits. Now, I mentioned how EFAs, because we think that probably at least half of the cover crops grown in the UK are linked to an EFA in the EPS system. So the EFA rules are for catch and cover crops that there is a limit on the number of species you can use. Growers can only use one cereal from this list of 3. So you'll see no wheat can be used. And the seed sown has to be a mixture. So besides at least one cereal, it has to include one of these non-cereals. And there is a list of only 5. And the rules say that no other species can be allowed. So it's quite prescriptive, and I think it's important that people realise that they have to stick to just those species. Coming now to nutrient capture, and this is where our interest particularly started with cover crops a number of years ago. So many growers ask, well, why is there any autumn nitrogen left behind in the soil that needs protecting? And it's very much because most of the cereal crops we grow are not very efficient at capturing nitrogen. They are typically only using perhaps 50%, 40% of what is applied. You can see here from RB209, medium clay soils, only 60% efficient. So 40% of what is applied is left behind after the cereal crop harvest. That then is potentially leachable out of the soils over winter and the autumn period. So here, that this particularly, and this is all of our findings. So these are looking at the loss of nitrogen in soil over the winter period from September to February. So you can see there's a correlation here, perhaps between the wetter west, Lancashire at the top and Dorset at the bottom, compare the drier east and middle Sussex, Essex and Kent at lower figures. Putting all that together, you can see an average of about 70 kilos lost. So that's a lot of value that's lost, that's been paid for, but it also creates a lot of pollution into drinking water sources. We've worked closely with a number of water companies, and this is just one example of a trial we did with Westwater. You can see here, the left-hand vertical axis is the cumulative loss of nitrogen from the soil over a period from October through to March. So taking the top example in light blue, the stubble bare land, you see cumulatively there's a loss there of 77 kilos of nitrogen over that winter period. Commercial cash crops like winter barley and winter wheat are quite effective at holding nitrogen back, but they're not as good as a cover crop because they are small plants. So if we go to the bottom, you can see a radish cover crop plant, in this case, has reduced the nitrogen loss over that period almost to nothing, indicating how successful cover crops are. The summary in red in the table from the 6 water trials is over a period of 4 years, monitoring 33 fields, they've seen about 59% loss of nitrogen reduction. Again, it's different work now from the University of East Anglia, comparing cover crops with bare fallow. Bare fallow shown in red, 2 cover crops in blue and green at the bottom. Again, looking at nitrogen loss, in this case from drinking water. And so you can see there very significant reductions in the losses of nitrogen over that winter period. And so the summary at the top shows between 75 and 88% reduction in nitrogen losses. Some work we've done ourselves. This was a colleague agronomist within Kings and Frontier. This was his MSc project. You can see here that the brassicas, the first 3 species, radish, turnip, rape and mustard, have been quite effective at catching nitrogen. In this case, we're measuring the nitrogen held in the green material above ground. So those cover crops have pulled out of the ground with no fertilizer applied between 70 and 110 kilos of nitrogen. So that's been locked up in a little bank account. That's been protected from losses over the winter. As soon as you make a mixture and put cereals with it, which are free on the right-hand side, the nitrogen capture reduces, but of course other benefits in stimulating fungi or offering a different grazing system. Looking at yield of the following crops, and this is where it starts to get interesting, we certainly see the yield of following crops being improved by improvements in soil structure, that's drainage, deeper rooting, and fast access to nutrient. There's an improvement in soil health, worms, fungi, bacteria, all working more together in harmony, stimulating better crop production. nitrogen transfer into the next crop, that's releasing nitrogen that's been captured over the winter into the following crop, and then a pest reduction opportunity, very much nematode reduction. So just as an example of some of the yield benefits cover crops can give, we commissioned the James Hutton Institute in Scotland to independently look at this for us. And over a 3-year period, in fully replicated plots, they looked at a whole series of parameters. And the final harvest in this 3-year program was in 2018. So in simple terms, what we did, we sowed exactly the same cover crop in exactly the same place in fields each year for 3 years, and followed them each year spring barley. So this would not have been naturally normal common practice, although it might actually work some parts of eastern Scotland where James Hutton are based. But we particularly wanted to understand what cover crops could do. And so of the final year, so control, the first histogram bar, gave a yield of 6 tons a hectare. Different cover crops have been able to boost those yields, and with a number of the brassica type mixtures, that's the first 4, they're all brassica mixtures, the yield bonus was certainly in most cases over half a ton a hectare. So this was a combination probably of better rooting, nitrogen being transferred back from the cover crop, and an improvement in soil health over a 3-year period. Root crops do, though, respond very well to cover crops. Weaknesses in soil structure can improve significantly, and this is just one example of some trials of our own. Hopefully, with the photograph on the right-hand side, you can see a line down the middle of the field. So the right-hand side of that photograph, which is darker green, was after a radish cover crop. And the difference between the left-hand side and right-hand side of the field was an extra 23 tons a hectare of sugar beet yield. So a very large increase, and I'm suggesting it can happen every time. But in this case, it was probably very much driven by a reduction in beet cyst nematode activity. So soil structure and soil health, though, would have played a part as well, and cumulatively, it was creating a much improved sugar beet yield. Looking at the crops that you might grow as cover crops, it is very important to choose those species carefully. You need to take into account the EFA rule, which I mentioned earlier on, the whole farm rotation, and that's important because you may be putting new species into your fields that are not grown normally, and how do they fit in with the rest of your rotation. Look carefully at the following crop itself. Decide what really the aim is for your cover cropping. Look at planting time, look at the longevity you want that cover crop and how you might destroy it, and the other needs like a grazing opportunity. So we certainly see as one of the most popular cover crops across the whole of the UK is simply a radish and oat mixture. That fits the EFA rules. There's a choice of radish varieties for different reasons. It is a great crop for catching nitrogen, as we've seen from all our trials. It offers grazing, and it's very good indeed for soil structuring. The radish root in particular is a key part of that. But for people who don't want brassicas, then a rye and vetch mixture might be appropriate. And the photograph here taken on the 20th of October shows vetch roots nodulating very well, fixing nitrogen for the autumn period, adding a different dimension to cover cropping. Alternatively, mixtures designed for soil structuring, perhaps with a number of different radishes in, can be very useful. I mentioned radish several times, I've mentioned roots. It's the power of those roots that's the important bit. And with a radish, we see it's not just that big taproot, it is the fine lateral roots, which are most important for creating tilth, structuring soils, and holding on to and catching all the nitrogen and soil that you want to stop being eroded or lost. The improvement in soil tilth can be quite dramatic. And we are seeing, for instance, as is shown here, some growers now are direct drilling sugar beet with no spring cultivations after a suitable cover crop. So they're allowing the cover crop to do the cultivations for them, looking after that carefully in the spring, enabling them to save a lot of money by direct drilling crops into those fields. Now, just lastly, to move on to finances and how we see cover crops working. There is obviously a cost. There's a seed cost, and this is all very general. Average is what I'm putting on the screen, and also this won't apply to every farm, but it's a guide as to what we see happen. So there's a seed cost of £40 a hectare, perhaps. There's obviously establishment costs, and depending on whether you use a contractor, whether you do it yourself, and you use a bio drill or a different system, put in a figure of perhaps £30 a hectare. Then there's the 9 back. So it costs of perhaps £70 a hectare or more. How are you going to get that back? So as we've seen earlier, we can catch a lot of nitrogen. 70 kilos, for example, today has got a value of about £40. So you can hold that, stop it from being lost. There is then a value on the organic matter and the soil vitality, and that will be different values for different farms, but there is a value there, and it may be as much as 20, 30, £40 a hectare. There's a straw structure value. There's a graze value, and that might be typically £40 a hectare. If you're lucky to be able to tie cover cropping into a stewardship scheme, there is a payment at £114 a hectare. There is an EFA opportunity, and that's got a value because you're not having to take land out of production to meet your EFA needs. You can sort your EFA needs out in the autumn before a spring crop. Importantly, as I mentioned earlier, allowing your cover crops to do cultivations for you is valuable. Many growers say to us there's a £70 or £80 a hectare saving in cultivation costs in the spring. There's the extra yield of the following crop which I've mentioned, and if it's half a ton of spring barley today, that might be worth £70. There's also a nematode reduction. So I've tried to illustrate that by spending 70 or 80 or a bit more pounds a hectare in establishing a cover crop, there are a number of opportunities to get that paid back very handsomely. Many people will be seeing a payback of over £200 a hectare. In future, of course, we may see water companies contributing to the cost and paying farmers separately. That is happening in some areas already. And then there is the new government scheme, the Environmental Land Management Scheme, coming forward. And that may well, and is quite clear, I think, to support cover cropping in an important way. So, to summarise now, I certainly think bare land in the autumn over the winter period is a very wasted opportunity. Cover crops do reduce nutrient loss and pollution. You can utilise green cover crops to harvest solar energy in August, September, October, and convert that into organic matter, which will help soil health. Careful use of green cover crops will help you optimise your farm resources, and that's very much about cheaper cultivations. Do consider your local options carefully, whether it's a stewardship scheme, working with a water company, or such examples as grazing. As I said, do look at stewardship. It's quite an important part, I think, of growing cover crops. Thank you very much. That's me finished.
Thank you very much, Paul. Who knew the humble radish could do so much good? It's certainly opened my eyes to rather a lot that I didn't know before. I hope the folks at home have found it as interesting as well. So without further ado, I'll move across to our second speaker, who is Jack Ham. And as I said, she is a research fellow in pedology at Cranwell University. So hello, Jack. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Wendy. Good evening.
Good evening. So I'm not going to say much about it. I don't want to steal your thunder, but I believe you're going to talk around making informed decisions on soil health from the work you've done with Cranfield and other areas of expertise.
Yep, that's right. Thanks very much. Yeah, I'm going to actually link some of that to some of the work that Paul's been talking about, to look at soil health and some of the benefits of cover crop soil health as well. And I'd like to just talk about initially some of the concepts of soil health, what that is. This is a terminology that's been bandied around at the moment. Just to look at about what sort of things we might measure, what do we mean by soil health, and look at some of the research that's been done that have linked to certain land management practices, like using cover crops, and what we can do in terms of measuring soils to understand the benefits of using those different things. So what is soil health? It's kind of holistic concept. So it's looking really at the whole system, not just one particular property of soils. It can be kind of captured in this quite nice quote that was used in a piece of work around about 20 years ago, actually. So it's not a new thing, but it's looking at benefits with soils on the rest of what we call these ecosystem services. So it's like, as we look after the soils, it will also look after food production. So we will get good yields. It will look after the ground habitat. It will clean our water. It will provide nutrients for those crops and the plants growing in it. It also provides cultural services to us as a society. If we have good soil health, we have good soil structure, that will help us with flood mitigation because water is held for a bit longer in the soils before it reaches the rivers. And there's also important aspects in terms of climate regulation, how carbon is sequestered in soils that can help with climate change. So what do we actually measure then? So how do we measure this sort of very holistic sort of concept? Unfortunately, we don't have this healthometer where we can stick it in the soil. There's lots of things that we can use, lots of sensors that will measure very specific things in soils, but we don't have this overall measurement that we can necessarily use. And what does it encompass? So it encompasses all these benefits and ecosystem services, but what we measure specifically in the soils? And it's actually a whole host of different things: biology, the chemistry and the physics of soils, and how they all interact together to give us this benefit, this healthy soil. So there's been quite a lot of work looking at what people actually measure in terms of soil health and soil quality. And there was a nice paper that was done by some people in the States just a couple of years ago. Then actually looking at the literature has been published about soil health and soil quality. It's looking literally at the frequency of an indicator, so a particular measurement that was mentioned in the literature, to understand then what are people using to give us sort of metric. So if we start at the bottom, those blue lines are looking at what we call sort of physical properties of soil, so water storage and bulk density and texture. These are all things that were commonly measured as health indicators. Not so much infiltration, actually, in aggregation, and these sorts of things obviously really were linked to things like flood prevention and runoff. And if we look at the middle bars in red, these are kind of indicators that are linked to chemistry. Obviously, farmers are measuring available nutrients in their soils quite regularly. So, of course, those things that come up: available potassium and nitrogen, total nitrogen, other things like pH. Again, really useful to have an indication in terms of what sort of management you might use. And one of the key indicators was organic matter or soil carbon. And again, this can be linked back to some of those ecosystem services. It creates good soil structure, it improves porosity. It's also then mitigating climate change if you can actually sequester that carbon. And then finally, so the smaller bars there in green, it's because most measurements taken over time have focused really on the chemistry and the physics. Soil biology is catching up. This is really important in terms of nutrient cycling in soils, in order to break down that organic matter and actually release nutrients to the crops that we're trying to grow as well. So those ones are a little bit less than some of the others, but altogether, this is kind of what we want to try and measure. So we can start to build, if you like, a picture of soil health by measuring lots of these different things. So I call this a simplified system. It may not look very simplified, it's a little bit complicated, the diagram, but we try to put that all together. So all that sort of list of things that I mentioned on the last slide, all those are just a couple of examples we've pulled out there. Those are the grey boxes in the middle. So specific things we can measure. If we have a sample of soil, we can do it in the laboratory or in the field directly itself. So things like nutrients. And then we've got on the other side there, those green boxes, and those are those ecosystem services that I was talking about in the first slide. So if we've got all these, a good indication of all these different things we can measure, what is it doing? What benefit is it giving? If we've got good soil health, then we have good ecosystem services in terms of yield, or food production, to water quality. Things like the weather, we can't do anything about, unfortunately, but we might want to make the system a bit more resilient to extreme weather. And then the other thing, big thing we can see at the other side there in terms of land management. So that really does affect a lot of those properties that we're trying to measure. So what we're doing in terms of managing our system is going to affect those soil properties and in turn affect the soil health. So these are sort of things you think, okay, well, you know, we can't sample everything, and we certainly haven't across most of the soils in the UK. What can farmers then potentially do to try and get an indication or a handle on those sorts of properties of the soils that will provide healthy soil, if you like? So we can change that sort of soil biodiversity. Think about simple things we can do on the farm, like counting earthworms, particular times of year in the spring and in autumn. We can take samples, we're taking samples ready for nutrients. We could also add organic matter. Lots of farmers are doing that already to those samples, give them an indication of how organic matter is changing. There might be indirect things we can use with data on the farm on fuel use. So you would expect then if your soils are very friable, they're not impacted, you will use less fuel in those systems. And there's lots of other things we can use just with a spade, to go out with a spade. This looking at soil structure, there's a particular process that you can work through. It's called the visual evaluation of soil structure. This gives an indicator that you have structure in your soil type or not. So there are lots of things that you can start to do to bring together some of the information to get an idea of sort of, you know, start to benchmark your system, to start to self-report, if you like, and start to monitor every year, every couple of years, some of these things that you think might change. And then obviously if we're thinking about making a change in terms of the land management, like we're talking about now, so how do we change that system, and the way we change land management will affect those different properties. So there's lots of different things that many farmers are doing. Lots of people talking about regenerative agriculture. What are we doing now? Reducing tillage, putting more amendments into the soil, looking at different types of rotations, people looking more mixed farming, bringing livestock back into arable systems. So we have a whole host of options available, but today's sort of focus really is on cover crops. So I'm going to look at giving some examples, and Paul's given some fantastic examples of some of the work they've been doing at King's of some of those benefits. So I'm just going to add a little bit more in terms of examples from some scientific studies where we've looked at data to try and measure, to try and quantify actually what the effects are on these soil properties by using cover crops. But initially, it's really important to find out what's happening on the ground. Paul mentioned renewed interest, a big increase, a big uptick in people making inquiries about using cover crops on farms. So we did a bit of work. This is one of my research students who commissioned a survey. So this was an online survey. Might be some people out there who filled it in. Thank you very much. It was really beneficial. This was commissioned, part of his PhD work, and he looked at trying to understand what the usage of cover crops was in the UK. It provided a snapshot of a particular year. So this was related to the overwinter between 2016 and 2017. And about 2/3 of the survey respondents were using cover crops. They were also asked lots of questions about their soils as well. And in that particular year, around about 1/5 of the farm area was planted with cover crops of those that were using it. And the figure itself showed you then, okay, well, it was really good, that there are lots of people using them that were answering the survey, obviously. But where, what sorts of things were they interested in, what sorts of things they were using at that time, and so on particular soil types. So was there a difference in terms of the species of cover crops they were using and the sorts of soils that they had on the farms? So the 3 rows at the top is the heavy soils, medium and light soils at the bottom, and then along the bottom are different cover crops that had been used. And darker areas indicate the greater number of people that are using that particular species on that soil. So you can see on different sets of heavier soils, people using oat and radish species, and the lighter soils tending to be clover, phacelia, and things like linseed. So whether this is due to them matching it to the soil type, some advice from seed companies, but also to think about, what sort of problems they might have in those different types of soils and the sorts of cover crops they might choose to try to improve the soils. And we also asked them to think about the benefits. So we talk a lot about these benefits, saying it does this, it does that. So we thought we'd ask the farmers directly what they thought in the survey. So these are a combination of responses that we got back. So we said, okay, what do you think are the positive or negative benefits for particular soil properties? So along the bottom, we've got some of these soil properties that we were talking about before that we might measure soil health, so structure, looking at other things like erosion, earthworm numbers, for example. So the most positive, so the greatest number of responses that we got, it said they saw a positive benefit with things like soil structure, soil erosion. Those are easy things to see. You can dig up and have a look at it with the spade. Erosion is obvious. Obviously, people are looking at earthworm numbers. Again, if you're looking at the structure, you can also look at earthworms in the same sample. And on the other end of the scale, then we had lots of uncertainty as well. So those purple bars is where the farmer wasn't sure what those benefits are. So still within some of those that got the top respondents, they still weren't sure whether they were seeing a benefit or not, whether it was because they weren't measuring them or they hadn't seen an observation. And in others, they were trying to see that whether there was any change or no change in those particular properties. But as you can see, there are very few that responded negatively to those particular properties we would expect to be beneficial. This provides a bit of an overview to say, okay, what's happening if the landscape is changing a bit, lots more people are starting to use cover crops. We asked them also then, well, okay, if those not using them, so there were also respondents of the survey who were using cover crops, what were then these potential barriers to the adoption? Why weren't you using them? So it's great, really good to see in Paul's presentation, putting some numbers actually on the uses of cover crops. And some of that, I think there's a lot of hesitation about using them because you have to make an outlay, of course. Obviously, it's still a crop. You still have to buy seed. It still needs to be managed. So it's really nice to see that broken down in terms of those other values or benefits that you can receive from the cover cropping. And also a lack of sort of detailed information about, what the actual effect of the cover crops are and how, that the farmers themselves might manage them on the farm. So these are the sorts of things I've been talking about, how the farmers can use, on-farm things, looking at the spade, looking at trying to look at structure, counting earthworms, these sorts of things to monitor how they might change. Again, another financial issue with funds and grants to help with the purchasing of seed. And interesting, one of the things that was coming up, so Paul mentioned in his talk, was looking at EFA guidelines, and a lot of farmers found those lists very restrictive. So if they wanted to use different species outside of cover crop mixture for a particular purpose, obviously they didn't meet the EFA rules. So quite often they were restricted in using that because they wanted to take advantage of the BPS for the cover cropping. Okay, so this is really nice to give us a sort of overview, what people are doing, what those barriers might be. So I'm just going to give some examples from the literature. So from some data, very quick overview of the sorts of benefits to soils of using cover crops. So what does the science say? So this is my very scientific thumbs up, thumbs down chart here. But Paul has actually touched on quite a lot of these already. So this is where there's kind of like agreement that there's a good benefit or not. So let's say for the first one I've taken here is soil erosion control. So in most of the literature, there are clear benefits to obviously covering bare soil in the overwinter period. We think about recent very windy conditions actually. So lots of people think of runoff, but also wind erosion is a big issue. So a few weeks ago we had these high winds. So a lot of that bare ground on those light soils was moving in certain areas, but obviously if there's a cover in that situation, that's going to control then that erosion. Organic and matter variable effects, some negative studies. Similarly with soil structure, again, it's quite difficult to try and repeat some of those field measurements. You need to be taking them at particular times of the year. Particularly with structure, you need to make sure that the soils are moist, so good to do it in the spring and the autumn. Similarly with the biology, again, doing earthworm counts. Earthworms are not active in the winter. They like to hibernate. It's too cold in the summer. There's not enough moisture for them in the surface. It's best to also do those measurements in the spring and the autumn. Again, different studies are showing different impacts on yield. Quite often this is due to weather conditions and not just the effect of the cover crop. And finally, Paul gave a really good illustration of though again that nitrogen retention of the cover crop, so to reduce then that nitrogen leaching to surface and groundwaters. Most studies show that there really is a positive benefit of those cover crops taking up nitrogen during the winter period. Lots of research has been done. There's lots more happening now in the UK as farmers are starting to use it. But a lot of these studies are in the USA and France, who have adopted cover crops in the last few decades. So we need to think about the context of where those studies are. Is it applicable to systems in the UK? But there are enough studies around now we can do what we call like a meta-analysis. So to summarise lots of different types of work to try and find out whether there are actual general trends. So I'm just going to go through a few examples of some of the soil properties and benefits that we've been looking at in terms of cover crops in the UK context. So this is a study done by some of my colleagues at Cranfield University. It's using some of the facilities from the two Centres for Agricultural Innovation that we have at Cranfield, the Agri-Epi Centre and CHAP, Centre for Applied Crop Science. So this is a specialist facility that we have. You kind of notice actually the glass house is really big. It's like a glass house on steroids. It has a gantry above it so we can image the crop as it's growing. And you can probably see in some of those boxes, we've got irrigation, control irrigation in some of those trials. And the little things sticking out are actually root cameras. We can actually look at the rooting system. So we can look at the above and the below ground effects of the cover crops. Like Paul said, you know, a lot of stuff is going on underground in the rooting systems. So this was a trial that was used that was repeated with initially single species of different cover crops. And one of the important things was actually looking at the change in the structure of the soil after the growth of the cover crop. So what happened? So if we look at these images and graphs on the left-hand side, so where they took different samples from different depths. So right in the surface at 15 centimetres, those two bars that are highlighted correspond to the two images on the other side. So CO is control. So this is where there was no crop and it was bare soil. And we have one image of mustard. So these two pictures that you see are actually X-rays. They're CT scans. So you might think about one of these when you go CT scan at the hospital. It's actually the same thing. It takes an image of the soil itself, so it can see inside the soil. And dark areas, they're actually spaces. They're the pore space. So these are really important in terms of aeration, in terms of holding onto water. You know, so great for all these for crop production, but also sort of flood mitigation. But in the surface, there wasn't any difference actually between the control plot and the mustard plot, or most of the other species that we used, except for buckwheat. When we looked further down, at 30 centimetres, you start to see those changes in structure. So if you look at the images again on the right hand side, the control, there's little pore space, not much black area in there, but you can see then the mustard then is created still lots of pore spaces amongst all of those soil aggregates. So it's improved then that structure with the root system after 90 days of growing. Some of the other species there, the buckwheat and the rye, also had a significant difference between the other cover crop species and the control after 90 days. This is a paper that was published by a group in Nottingham, again using a similar technology, this scanning, this CT scanning, but it's building up a stack of pictures where you can look at the root itself. There's three different, and they split the pots that the plants were grown. So in the top, this was not compacted, but at depth they simulated a plough pan, so they compacted the soil. And they wanted to actually look at the morphology of those roots and how they could penetrate through that compacted layer. So you see then the tillage radish, the main taproot kind of meets that compacted layer, and some of those fibrous roots are going through that. Vetch has a bit of a problem trying to get through that compacted layer, and those grass species like black oats are really good at penetrating through that, so they don't seem to be bothered at all by that compacted layer. There's differences in the morphology of the root systems that are actually having an impact on trying to remediate, if you like, the structure of those soils in that compacted area. And what about things like carbon? This is a really hot topic, thinking about, climate change mitigation. Do we actually see a benefit or not to increasing carbon? And this is from a recent piece of work that was published, not by us, but some other people, that looked at what we call a meta-analysis. Looked at all of the literature related to cover cropping and whether they had measured soil carbon. So the graph itself shows then the concentration of soil carbon between 0 and, so the top soil between 0 and 30 centimetres, and the solid lines then are the means of those groups that they picked out. So they've got three types of cover crops, so non-legume in green, in blue legume, and the mixtures at the bottom. And they looked at all these kind of effects over all these different studies, and they saw a small increase in the carbon content by using a cover crop compared to bare ground. There's lots of variation. Those dashed lines show you what we call 95 confidence levels. That's the variability between all studies around that mean. So you can see there's quite a lot of overlap and variability. And this is obviously dependent on the type of soil that the study was conducted in, the climate under which that was done, and the different types of mixtures they might have used for those different types of cover crops. Paul did a great job of looking at end leaching, so I'm not going to look at this in great detail, but most of the studies agree to show that a real benefit to retaining nitrogen in the cover crop itself. So nitrogen significantly reduced then by using cover crops, so that's shown compared to the control in the graph. And then Paul mentioned also lots of water companies now using this as part of their catchment management plans to try to reduce nitrates in surface and groundwaters by encouraging farmers then to capture that nitrogen over the winter when it's really susceptible to leaching. And what about the biology? So, forgotten, you think back to that slide near the beginning where there's not many studies measuring the biology. They're really important in terms of turnover, organic matter, of making sure nutrients are available to both cover crops, but also the cash crops as well. So again, this was part of a meta-analysis. It's another paper that looks at lots of different studies that are being done. And at the top of that graph there are various indicators along the left-hand side, which are just the types of measurements you might use to look at the abundance. So just a number of microorganisms that are in the sample. And that shows quite clearly then that shift away from a positive shift from 0 to 0.6.2 shows there's a positive effect of increase in abundance of these of microbes using a cover crop compared to their fallow. Similarly, these activity parameters. So this is like how active biology is. It might be there, but it might be doing anything. So one thing is looking at respiration. Something you might have seen these carbon dioxide burst tests that have been used. That's an indication of the activity. So, you know, how active those microbes are. Again, those showed an increase in the cover crops compared to their fallow. And then the third one at the bottom is looking actually at the diversities. What are these different organisms doing? What roles do they have? There was again a positive increase, but much smaller effect compared to some of the other measurements that are being taken. But these kind of diversity indicators are used less often in these sorts of studies. So it may be that it's down to the fact that there's not so many studies that are looking at these sorts of things. So we start to see this sort of beneficial effect. So we've talked about some of those data that have given us some indication of the positives of things we can do. How can we change those soil properties in order to increase the soil health or make it beneficial, and in turn make sure all those ecosystem services are being delivered? So we have, on the one hand, good yield. We can reduce the impacts on water quality. We can also look at carbon sequestration. So it starts to do all of those things. So here's just to summarize really, okay, well, you've got this information now, but what can I do? What can I start doing with it? So think about targeting, specific areas. What primarily do you want the cover crops to do? Do you want them to fix nitrogen? Would you like them to stop erosion? Would you like them to sequester carbon? Like anything, there's no unicorn, so quite often they won't do that, but your particular soils, and you'll know there's something that you need to do something about, and it might be it's a particular compaction issue in one field, for example. And then how do you know what's going to work? So find out what works on your soil type in your sort of rotation, talk to other farmers who are using them, go to these sorts of events, talk to the seed companies, join some of the demonstration farms, innovative farmer networks. Measure. So if we go back again to thinking about soil health, it's all very well making a change in your system, but you really need to understand, is it making a difference or not? So in terms of soil specifically, get some baseline measurements now of those key indicators, so that those grey boxes that I showed you in the complicated diagram earlier, but this can be fairly, simple measurements that you can use. Go through the advice on looking at soil structure, counting the earthworms, but make sure you go back and monitor, repeat those measurements. Easy win is adding organic matter, so loss and ignition, to the suite of measurements that you have to make already every 5 years under new farming rules for water. So you do the nutrient analysis, adding on that organic matter, so then you can start to process, to track those changes from the changes in management, and start now. There's lots of information and hopefully enough peer-to-peer information there to do that. And as Paul mentioned, it's likely that there will be additional benefits in the future under the new ELMS scheme. Join the ELMS pilots. These are being piloted now by DEFRA. Again, try to think about the sort of measurements that you want to make to your soils. What is easy for you to do and for you to monitor and measure that can be integrated into some of the farm management systems that you're using already. Okay, so that's about it for me. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Jack. That was amazing. I didn't realise how much research was going on in the background, to be honest. It's quite opened my eyes. So thank you very much, Jack. So I think probably now would be better to bring Paul back into the picture as well, because I've had a couple of questions actually emailed into me prior to this event. So I'd just like to get kind of both your thoughts on these particular questions. So who wants to go first? Shall we come to you first, Paul? So if you answer this question, then Jack, you fill the blanks like you did so well there, and backing up what Paul was saying. So are cover crops beneficial to all types of soil? So this is in relation to heavy textured clay mixes. And if so, are there any specific established conditions required to make these beneficial?
I think cover crops in general are beneficial to all soils. The key to success, though, will be choosing the right cover crop for the soil and the rotation. You definitely must put the soil and the rotation together. And so, next part of it, which conditions you want. The key, I'm sure, to successful cover cropping is actually establishing early, as soon as possible after the cash crop has gone before. So after a wheat harvest or after an oilseed grape crop, key to it, getting them to work well on any soil will be to plant them as soon as possible, within a few days of the harvest of the previous crop. And then you get the maximum time for them to grow before winter sets in, and they can do the maximum benefit. That will apply to all soil types.
Anything on that?
Yeah, no, just to go back to one of my last points is actually to think about what we want to use them for. And quite often it will depend on the soil type that you have. So you might want to change the structure, or you might want to control erosion, for example, on light soils. So quite often the soil type will guide you almost towards a kind of cover crop that you might use to think about solving a particular issue or a problem that you might have. I mean, one thing also to consider in the whole as well, you know, is absolutely right in terms of the rotation, how that will work with the rotation that you have to get them started early, but also to think about the other end as well. So how are you going to do at the termination point in the spring? A lot of these species are sensitive, so they will senesce over the winter, but not all of them, and quite often they spring back. And you know, you might not get a frost, so our weather is changing as well, so these things, you know, need to be taken into consideration. You might want to use grading as well. Is that appropriate for the rotation that you're in? Do you have access to livestock? These sorts of things.
Yeah, really key, I think. So thinking about, we were saying there's been a lot of research, a lot of expertise, and a lot of things going on. Do you think there is any additional support that the government could provide for farmers and enable them to increase the adoption within farming practices? And that way it would enable them to get better soil health and monitoring systems in place. Jack, you go first, I think, this time.
Yeah, so as we talked about the new ELM systems, the environmental land management. So this will eventually replace the basic payment system, the subsidies that we get from the European Union at the moment. So there is a lot of discussion about what goes in that. It's not transparent at the moment, but there is a lot of discussion, or there has been in government, about improving soil health. So I think, unfortunately, it's not now, but there will be in the future some requirement, if you like now. It might not be very different to some things that farmers are already doing. So you might want to maybe change some of the EFA rules to make it a little bit more inclusive. But there will, I think, you know, be some kind of monitoring system, so some sort of self-reporting that the farmers will probably have to do under the ELM scheme in order for you to receive a payment. So think about doing now, you know, and hopefully that there will be some support in that transition if you're transitioning your farming system within that the ELM system, the transition from basic payment to ELMS.
Any else, Paul?
Yeah, I agree exactly with what Jack's just said. The other area that really needs some attention is understanding the nutrient return back to the following cash crop. It is important, as we've both said, that cover crops are used to capture nitrogen to stop it being lost, because that's a financial penalty. If you lose it, it goes down the drain. But there's no real great certainty yet as to when that nitrogen, for instance, that's held in a cover crop returns to the following spring barley or spring bean crop. Is it within 2 months? Is it within 6 months? Does it take 2 years? Nobody really knows. And so that's an area that farmers very much like some guidance on, to help them then understand what nutrient they need to apply to the following crops. Can they cut back with confidence, know when the nitrogen, for instance, from a crop is going to be returned back into the nitrogen cycle? That's an area I think that does need some attention.
Lovely. I can't thank you guys enough. I hope all the people at home, just like myself, have literally enjoyed it, first and foremost, learned a lot, definitely, encouraged in what is happening to help support the state of farming, and hopefully, as I say, I've taken away quite a bit for food for thought. So, like myself, I'd like to thank you, Paul Brown from King's, part of Frontier Agriculture Ltd, and Jack Hanna, from Cranfield University. I've really enjoyed our session. What we're going to do in a minute is pop up a little slide, which will have a QR code and link on there. And we'd really appreciate your feedback, as we want to be able to deliver future events that really help you guys with the sustainability. And like they say, like my vision that I mentioned at the very beginning, what I want to achieve with ourselves within the AgriTech programme, but not only ourselves, but I think everybody wants to achieve, is support the UK food supply chain to become the most sustainable ecosystem in the world. And that's through events like today, demystifying technology, encouraging collaboration. And again, I can't thank these guys enough, and you guys at home, for watching and listening and taking part, so that we again can feed the world without wrecking the planet. So again, thank you very much, Jack. Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you everyone at home. Please do let us have your feedback, and we hope to do many more events like this to help you in the future. Thank you.